This documentary contains real historical accounts of war, violence, and injury. These are presented in full for historical accuracy, but viewer discretion is advised. Oh, dang. I don't think Epic History has ever put something like this in the beginning of a video. So, yeah, I think we're gonna get ready for some real spicy content. Spaniards, after a long agony, your nation was perishing. I have seen your pain, and I am bringing you a remedy. Me! Yeah, this is really Napoleon. I like his... Oh, pretty like... Yeah, not his, what's the word I'm looking for? The Spanish campaign as a whole really was one of Napoleon's biggest blunders, one of his biggest mistakes. And yeah, it's just like, I think the biggest tragedy of all of it is how unnecessary it was. Like, Spain was already Napoleon's ally, probably one of his few long-standing allies, and he just completely made an enemy out of them. Like, this bleeding ulcer, I think as he called it, really was just something he didn't need to bring, but he brought it all on himself. And it really was just like funny just how, you know, Napoleon really looked down on Spain, especially their government and their armies, and really thought, oh, this will be easy conquest. And it's just completely backfired on him. Yeah.
In 1808, French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte launched a war against Spain, until then one of France's closest allies. But Napoleon saw a country that was backward, enthralled to its priests, and ruled by an incompetent, dissolute monarchy. He intended to sweep away these corrupt institutions and bestow upon Spain the benefits of Napoleonic rule: reform, modernization, efficient government. The Spanish people...
That's the thing, really. Maybe Napoleon would, or Napoleonic rule would have maybe been better. Okay, before you jump on me, all I'm saying is Napoleon, for all its, was pretty good at reforming and doing all that. The problem was he wasn't Spanish. Like, the Spanish people, you know, for as bad as and incompetent as their monarchy was, at least they were Spanish, right? This was a foreign power, essentially, just exerting its influence on a place it wasn't wanted. Like I said, maybe Napoleon would have been better than, you know, their monarchy, at least in terms of reforming and governing, but again, at the same time, they didn't ask for him, right? And they just viewed him as just an outside invader. Yeah, it's like, hey, these guys might suck, but at least they're Spanish. At least they're one of us, you know? You know, it's like, And Napoleon didn't help endear himself either, because his marshal's conduct in Spain was not really great. Like, the marshals were bickering with each other. Some of them treated the Spaniards really awfully. Except like Suchet. Suchet was perfect in Spain. But unfortunately, the other marshals didn't do what he did. And it's just like, you know... Yeah, you know.
Pious and loyal, reacted with fury. The result was a savage war that lasted nearly 6 years, costing 500,000 lives and helping to bring down Napoleon's empire. For the Spanish, it was their war of independence. For their British allies, the Peninsular War. These are the voices of witnesses.
And for Napoleon, his bleeding old, sir.
To those momentous days. In the spring of 1808, French troops, posing as Spain's allies, occupied many Spanish cities by stealth. But as it became clear Napoleon intended to depose the Spanish royal family,
I just love the propaganda of just seeing a short, like, devious Napoleon. But don't be alarmed, my good friend. I'll take care of your crown. It can't be in better hands.
Opposition mounted. In Madrid, on the 2nd of May, a tense situation between locals and French troops exploded into violence. The famous Dos de Mayo. A local priest witnessed the uprising.
Blind with the rage and fury, some fired on the French from windows and street corners. Others flung themselves on their very ranks. Still others hurled stones, pieces of furniture and pots and pans from the balconies, where they were joined by women armed with cauldrons of boiling water. It really seemed as if there was not a single person who did not want to water the streets with French blood, even at the cost of their own.
For all its fame, French losses in this revolt were only 31 dead and 114 wounded. But stern French reprisals saw around 300 Spanish prisoners shot and set the tone for a war that was to be fought to the knife, with terrible cruelty on both sides. As Napoleon announced that his brother Joseph would be the new King of Spain, fighting spread across the country. At Zaragoza, Spanish soldiers and civilians joined forces to defend the city against the French.
About 1 o'clock, the French troops approached the city, whereupon we immediately opened fire on them. This was accompanied by a display of valor on the part of the inhabitants that has few equals. Seeing that the French were inside the walls, they rushed to confront them, with no other protection than their own noble breasts, and forced them to retreat in a hail of fire.
Captain Józef Mieroszynski was a Polish officer serving in Napoleon's army and took part in the assault.
A bloody fight began, and the defenders of Zaragoza for the first time saw their enemies checked. This cheered them, and whole mobs of them now began to rush towards the gate. Crowding into the houses that overlooked it, they opened fire from the windows and roofs on our men, who could not see them, to fire back. With a hail of fire crisscrossing our columns from all directions, General Lefebvre recognized the need to fall back from the walls of the city and gave the order to retreat.
Yeah, the Battle of Zaragoza really was such a great resistance on the Spanish people's part. I believe we covered it with the Kings and Generals Napoleon series. And, it really showed the resolve of the Spanish people and what made them so formidable in fighting Napoleon. They were ready to fight till literally the last Spanish person on Spain, right? They were ready to fight, you know. Everyone was in. It was kind of like it wasn't just the Spanish army, it was like the people all as one, you know? And it's just that power, man, you know?
The people were in great confusion, but this in no way interfered with the unmatched heroism they displayed. This was especially true of the women, who from the very beginning kept the defenders supplied with water, wine, and brandy, and mingling among their ranks, reanimated their spirits, and helped them to defeat an enemy who was as daring as he was ferocious. The destruction that we suffered was very great.
Stitch Fix is so convenient. You go through the style quiz. What is your fit? What's your style?
That summer, Napoleon's most stubborn enemy, Britain, sent forces to aid Spain and Portugal, which the French had also invaded. In July, around 14,000 British troops landed at Mondego Bay. Among them, Private Harris of the 95th Rifles, thrust into action at Rolisa just days after disembarking.
The Rifles indeed fought well this day, and we lost many men. Joseph Colquhoun was by my side, loading and firing very industriously. Thirsting with heat and action, he lifted his canteen to his mouth. "Here's to you, old boy," he said, as he took a pull at its contents. As he did so, a bullet went through the canteen, perforating his brain, killed him in a moment. Another man fell close to him almost immediately, struck by a ball in the thigh. Indeed, we caught it severely just here. I saw a man named Simmons struck full in the face by a round shot, and he came to the ground a headless trunk.
British and French regiments were...
Dang, that's insane, man. Also, I will comment now that I do enjoy the voices that he's putting. It kind of does add into the immersion of the moment, and usually it's saving me because usually I'm the one. I usually pause the video to read out loud the quotes he puts on screen. Excuse me, I'm sorry. So it's definitely better to just. I do really like this little inclusion. I think it's really interesting and very nice. Though it is cool to hear directly from the accounts of people who witnessed this, because I do feel that kind of adds, you know, first-hand eyewitness accounts, yeah, or just kind of really do transport you and paint a vivid image, right? In the mind of when you're hearing about just what's going on, you know?
Were accompanied by a number of women who provided services from laundry to nursing, and often married men in the regiment. They knew any battle might bring dreaded news.
When the roll was called after the battle, the females who missed their husbands came along the front of the line to inquire of the survivors whether they knew anything about them. Amongst other names, I heard that of Colquhoun called in a female voice, without being replied to. As I looked at the poor sobbing creature before me, I felt unable to tell her of his death.
For all the horrors of battle, it was the ferocity of Spanish and Portuguese partisans that alarmed French soldiers most. French convoys and messengers were particularly vulnerable to ambush by these guerrilla fighters, and never traveled without an escort. Captain Marbeau was one such messenger, sent out at night with urgent dispatches.
The officer commanding our advance guard gave me a troop horse and 2 orderlies, and I went on my way in brilliant moonlight. When we had gone 2 or 3 leagues, we heard several musket shots, and bullets whistled close past us. We could not see the marksmen, who were hidden among the rocks.
But the most terrifying fate was to be taken alive by the guerrillas.
A little further on, we found the corpses of 2 French soldiers, recently killed. They were entirely stripped, but their shakos were near them. Some little distance further, we saw a horrible sight a young officer of the 10th, still wearing his uniform, was nailed by his hands and feet, head downwards, to a barn door. A small fire had been lit beneath him. Happily, his torches had been ended by death. But as the blood was still flowing from his wounds, it was clear the murderers were not far off.
Such sickening discovery.
Yeah, this was like a nightmare for the French soldiers, wasn't it? Just going through all this, like, it really was just like a guerrilla war, you know, kind of like Napoleon's Vietnam. And yeah, I pity the soldiers who were involved in this conflict in particular, because this is like 6 years of just, ugh, like the nightmares, right?
Led to savage French reprisals, fueling a cycle of atrocities by both sides.
A few grenadiers and a woman canteen keeper, having dropped behind, stopped in a village to pass the night. Next day, they were given a guide who led them into a prepared ambush. There, their throats were all cut, with refinements of cruelty. The commandant of the battalion, informed of this horrible ambush, marched on the village, had it burned to the ground, seized all the able-bodied men, and announced he would have them all put to death if they did not point out the murderers. 4 refused to confess and were shot. But the 5th revealed the assassins. They were present. They were shot.
All the elite companies were got together. The aim was to drive off the brigands who from time to time raided our lines and cut us off from every supply of food. We found the brigands barricaded in a little town called Alcanes. After a sharp fight, we got into the place and it was given over to us for pillage. Having murdered everyone and looted everything in sight, we stayed on for another 6 weeks. The brigands attacked us several times, but they could achieve nothing. However, whenever they caught someone from our side, they subjected him to martyrdom. Their tongues and nails were torn out, and then they were roasted alive.
In 1809, one British naval officer watched from his ship as French troops sacked the Spanish town of Corcubillon.
We observed the French soldiers pouring into the wretched town from both sides of the valley. Many of the inhabitants rushed to the fishing boats on the beach, and leaping into them indiscriminately, pushed into the stream. As we rowed up the harbour, we met hundreds of these poor people, half-dressed, screaming, and struggling hard to get beyond the reach of shot. Others fled along the sides of the hills towards the bay, hoping to be picked off the shore by boats or to conceal themselves amongst the rocks. Of these fugitives, great numbers were brought down by the fire of the enemy. So completely hemmed in were these wretched people that escape is almost impossible. The horror and confusion of this frightful spectacle were increased by the conflagration of the town, in the streets of which deeds of still greater atrocity were going on.
The war in Spain had begun disastrously for the French. They faced unexpected and ferocious resistance across the country, forcing Napoleon to intervene personally with massive reinforcements. The Spanish armies were defeated. Their British allies scrambled to escape, beginning a desperate winter retreat through the mountains towards the port city of Coruña.
It became everyone for himself. The load we carried was too great, and we staggered on, looking neither to the right nor the left. If a man dropped, he found it no easy matter to get up again, unless his companion assisted him, and many died of fatigue. As for myself, I was nearly floored by this march, and on reaching a town one night, which I think was called Zamora. I fell at the entrance of the first street we came to. The sight left my eyes, my brain reeled, and I came down like a dead man. The enemy, I should think, were at this time frequently close upon our trail, and I thought at times I heard their trumpets come down the wind as we marched. Towards the dusk of the evening of this day, I remember passing a man and woman lying clasped in each other's arms and dying in the snow. I knew them both, but it was impossible to help them.
British forces did manage to escape by sea, despite heavy losses. And later that year, under the command of the future Duke of Wellington, they joined forces with the Spanish and defeated the French in battle at Talavera. Lieutenant Simmons of the 95th Rifles missed the battle, but saw its grim aftermath.
The horrid sights were beyond anything I could have imagined. Thousands dead and dying in every direction. Horses, men, French and English, in whole lines who had cut each other down. And, I'm sorry to say, the Spaniards butchering the wounded Frenchmen at every opportunity and stripping them naked, which gave admission to the attacks of myriads of pernicious flies and the heat of a burning sun.
The fate of captured soldiers in a country where all armies were continually short of water and supplies could also be dire. Spanish private Juan Manuel Sarasa was taken prisoner near Badajoz in 1811.
It would have been difficult to conduct the journey in a war's manner. It really seemed as if they wanted to starve us to death. When we set out each morning, we left behind the bodies of friends and comrades who had died in the night. Meanwhile, from the rear of the column, alas, there would come a constant rattle of shots. It was the French, finishing off the poor men who could not drag themselves along any further. Reduced to mere specters, we did our best to help one another along, for to fall behind meant certain death. But one by one, we were forced to abandon our friends and bid them farewell forever.
Just a few months into the war, Napoleon left Spain, never to return. As he occupied himself with affairs in Central Europe and his plans to invade Russia, French forces in Spain were left badly neglected. It was a sorry situation for proud soldiers of the Grande Armée, such as Colonel Noël, who in 1811 was part of Marshal Massena's retreat from Portugal.
Our supply situation was deplorable. We lacked everything: food, clothing, boots, money, and horses. 6 months of deprivation in a country without any supplies and depending on marauding to live had not lessened the army's courage, but had exhausted it and destroyed its discipline. We had left sad memories behind us with the Portuguese, and they would curse the name of France for a long while. Survival had been necessary, it is true, but bad soldiers had behaved like brigands towards the unfortunate peasantry. If, in their turn, the Portuguese showed themselves to be savage toward our prisoners and wounded, this can be understood, although not excused. The failure of this campaign in Portugal has been blamed on the commanding general. This is quite wrong. The responsibility must lie with Napoleon, who alone wanted this war and forced it upon his generals without giving them the means of ensuring success.
Yet,
You know, Man, that was like legit the most realistic that the colonel just stated. But it's kind of true though. Like I said, this war was really unnecessary. Napoleon started it even though he really didn't have to. And you know, essentially even like poor Massena, who, like I've mentioned before, Massena being my favorite, well, my second favorite marshal after Davout, like, the way he got treated was really, really awfully. You know, he didn't even want to be there. He was already, like, really past his prime, and physically not all that well, even blind on one eye. Because Napoleon shot him, I'm still not over that. I'm like, what the heck? Really, Napoleon shot him. But, you know, and it's like, Massena wasn't given, I think, the man he was promised. And while Napoleon was there, obviously you see so much of this blue gain because of Napoleon. When he was there, he quickly turned the tide, and you kind of expect that from the great Napoleon. But then he left to handle other things, and then, like, you know, just left his marshals to deal with it. He didn't come back, and a lot of his orders he was giving were outdated, and I think he was, like, blaming a lot of people for their performance in Spain. Like, oh, Massena, how could you not just win the war already? Like, you know, and it's like Napoleon didn't seem to realize just, like, why this situation was so bad for so many of his marshals. He just probably just wrote it off as, oh, you guys suck, you can't get the job done, even though there's so much more to that. Like, this really was many of the marshals' worst, like, nightmare, right? And it's like, Napoleon wasted so much manpower. And really the biggest thing is that all it did was give the British a place to invade now. A bigger place to invade, and it threatened the West, that Napoleon never had to fully worry about his, you know, westward, about being invaded from here. But after making an enemy of Spain, not only did he have to deal with the East, the approaching enemies of the East, but now he had to watch here, and it just created, like, a bigger problem for him, you know? And yeah, really it is all just Napoleon's fault. Like, you know, Napoleon's great. A lot of us like talking about Napoleon. There's a lot of great things Napoleon did. A lot of great qualities he had. Intelligence, genius, you know, very skilled and talented. But yeah, the man made really big mistakes. Really big blunders as well. And he's not perfect, you know, not a perfect man. And there's obviously many people who would write him off as a villain in history. And yeah, I can definitely see where some of those people come from, you know. To some, Napoleon's a hero. To others, he's a villain. To others, he's a bit of both, you know. Obviously, and this is one of his, like, low points. You could really point at this and just be like, yeah, Napoleon sucked. This really sucked. Like, Napoleon did something really bad here, you know? And, yeah, and this is, like, the conduct of the Spanish was not well. I mean, the conduct of the French, I mean, wasn't well with how they were handling things. You know, with the... And even their returned cruelty towards the Spanish, right? It's like, you know, really just comes across as just cruel oppressors, you know? Like I said, Suchet carried. I love Marshal Suchet. This was his moment. If anything came out of this, Suchet proved himself as, like, the best marshal, at least in the Peninsula War. You know?
Despite their retreat from Portugal, the French would continue to fight tenaciously in Spain, as the British discovered the following year, when they attacked the fortified city of Badajoz.
On our arriving at the breach, the French sentry on the wall cried out, "Who comes there?" 3 times, or words to that effect in his own language. On no answer being given, a shower of shot, canister and grape together with fireballs was hurled at random among us. I myself received 2 small slug shots in my left knee, and a musket shot in my side, which must have been mortal had it not been for my canteen. For the bolt penetrated that and passed out, making 2 holes in it, and then entered my side slightly. Still, I stuck to my ladder and got into the entrenchment. Numbers had by this time fallen, but the cry from our commanders being, "Come on, my lads!" We hastened to the breach, but there, to our great surprise and discouragement, we found the chevaux de frise had been fixed and a deep entrenchment made, from behind which the garrison opened a deadly fire on us. Vain attempts were made to remove this fearful obstacle, during which my left hand was dreadfully cut by one of the blades. But finding no success in that quarter, we were forced to retire for a time. My wounds were still bleeding, and I began to feel very weak. My comrades persuaded me to go to the rear, but this proved a task of great difficulty. I was so weak myself that I could scarcely walk, so I crawled on my hands and knees till I got out of reach of the enemy's musketry.
We rushed forward to the breaches, where a most frightful scene of carnage was going on. The ditch was covered with dead and dying soldiers. If a man fell wounded, 10 to 1 that he ever rose again. For the volleys of musketry and grape shot that were incessantly poured upon us made our situation too horrid for description. I had seen some fighting, but nothing like this. We remained passively here to be slaughtered, as we could do the besieged little injury from the ditch.
The British assault on Badajoz did finally succeed. Its fall paved the way for Wellington's advance into Spain in 1812, where he met the French in battle at Salamanca. British morale was sky high.
There assuredly never was an army so anxious as ours was to be brought into action. They were a magnificent body of well-tried soldiers, highly equipped and in the highest health and spirits, with the most devoted confidence in their leader, and an invincible confidence in themselves.
When the British advance began, that confidence was soon put to the test.
A craggy ridge on which the French infantry were drawn up rose so abruptly that they could fire 4 or 5 deep. The fire of musketry was by far the heaviest I have ever experienced, and was accompanied by constant discharges of grape. An uninterrupted blaze was then maintained so that the crest of the hills seemed to be one long streak of flame. At the very first volley that we received, about 80 men of the right rear of my regiment fell to the rear in one group. The commanding officer immediately rode up to know the cause, and found that they were all wounded.
The enemy's shot and shell were now making dreadful havoc. A Portuguese cadet who was attached to our regiment received a shell in the center of his body, which, bursting at the same instant, literally blew him to pieces. Another poor fellow receiving a grape shot across his belly. His bowels protruded, and he was obliged to apply both his hands to the wound to keep them in. I shall never forget the expression of agony depicted in his countenance.
Salamanca was a great Allied victory, and though Wellington had to retreat back to the Portuguese frontier that winter, his next advance, in 1813, was decisive. The French abandoned southern Spain and Madrid, and retreated to Vitoria. Here, King Joseph and Marshal Jourdan made their stand. But the Allied attack proved irresistible.
We advanced through the tumultuous scene with a battery in our front, dealing out dire destruction. Men and officers fell in every direction, and their wounds were most dreadful, being all inflicted with cannonballs or shells, except that of our colonel, who received a musket shot in his stomach. Our front had to contend with the French regiment on the right of the battery, But after politely receiving us with a few sharp volleys, which we as politely returned, they retreated into a thicket. Towards this, we advanced firing and drove them furiously before us till they were completely routed.
I came across a poor wounded Frenchman crying to us English not to leave him as he was afraid of the bloodthirsty Spaniards. Poor fellow could not at most live more than 2 hours, as a cannonball had completely carried off both thighs. He entreated me to stay with him, but I only did so as long as I found it convenient. I saw that he could not last long, and very little sympathy could be expected from me then, so I ransacked his pockets and knapsack and found a piece of pork ready cooked and 3 or 4 pounds of bread, which I thought would be very acceptable. The poor fellow asked me to leave him a portion, so I cut off a piece of bread and meat and emptied the beans out of my haversack, which I left by his side. I then continued on my way up the hill.
For soldiers on the losing side, the aftermath of battle could be a terrifying and uncertain time.
We retreated through a mass of wagons, horses, and overturned cannon which littered the field. I crossed a ditch that was completely filled with dead and wounded. 2 enemy cavalrymen came close to me, and as I could not fire with my wet ammunition, I put my musket over my shoulder and hung my head, awaiting my fate. But the cavalrymen went off to cut down some scattered Frenchmen on the field. Dusk fell, and I was at a loss as to which way to go. In the darkness, a whistle directed me to a nearby bush. I listened and heard French being spoken. Several soldiers from the 44th Regiment, belonging to our division, answered my call.
For some Allied soldiers, the aftermath of Vitoria was the opportunity of a lifetime, as King Joseph's entire treasury had been abandoned by the fleeing enemy.
About dusk, the head of our column came suddenly on some wagons. Someone called out, "There are money carts!" No sooner were the words uttered than the division broke, as if by word of command. And in an instant, the covers disappeared from the wagons, and nothing was seen but a mass of inverted legs, while the arms were groping for dollars. For money, it certainly was. The scene was disgraceful, but at the same time ludicrous. I was sent to endeavor to clear one of these wagons, at which I at length succeeded. Not, however, until the money had disappeared, when to my surprise I discovered an officer at the bottom with his hands full of the precious metal. I shall not mention either his name or his regiment.
Wellington's victory at Vitoria was the final, fatal blow to Napoleon's empire in Spain. There was bitter fighting still to come at San Sebastian and in the Pyrenees, but French defeat was now assured. Within a few months, British, Spanish, and Portuguese troops would cross into France itself. The Peninsular War had been a long and bloody road. Many thousands of lives had been lost on all sides, some through violence, most from disease.
That's still insane that so much of it was just sickness. That's insane, dude. Oh, man. Holy crap.
Towns and villages had been laid waste. Cities and churches looted. Civilians massacred. The terrible effects of war were not quickly forgotten by the land, nor by those who lived through them. The Peninsular War was a calamity for Napoleon, in a career better known for its military triumphs. And if you want to see Napoleon near his peak in a desperate battle that pushed him to the limit, look no further than our next video, the Battle of Marengo. It's a clash that looms large in Napoleonic legend, but behind the myth lies a less flattering reality. So join us as we reconstruct Marengo hour by hour. This video isn't out on YouTube yet, but if you want to watch it now, you can head over to prestige streaming service Nebula. Nebula is a streaming service built by creators to offer a superior...
So yeah, we have already watched the Battle of Marengo. I believe it came out yesterday. And yeah, this was a very unique video for Epic History. It's definitely different from all his other videos, because here he directly takes basically these dramatic readings from the Peninsula War, and kind of felt like I was just listening to an audiobook for a second, and I mean that in the best way possible. Like, this was a really great reading and, dramatic reading of these events, and it's just interesting to, just see exactly what people saw. And it was obviously brutal. This was a very brutal conflict, and I think you can definitely tell from just from these accounts just how awful this whole thing was. And like I said, I just view it as one of Napoleon's worst mistakes. It really is. And all his fault. He definitely brings this all on himself, And yeah, that's really all I've got for now, though. I really enjoyed this video, and I'm looking forward to where we go to next. So until then, I'll see you all in the next video. Bye, everyone.